This story is a romantic comedy fueled by spreadsheets, pride, and tension in the air-conditioned silence. She's focus and discipline, the kind who gives you nothing. He's control and provocation, the kind who refuses to be ignored. When they cross paths, the whole floor seems to notice before they do. The morning had the particular kind of grey that made sensible people stay in bed. It was the sort of cold that crept under coat collars and turned coffee into a survival strategy rather than a preference. The kind of Tuesday in November that Manhattan offered with absolutely zero apology. The lobby of Calloway & Reed's corporate headquarters was already buzzing with the mechanical hum of badge scanners, elevator chimes, and the low percussion of leather shoes on marble floors, all of it underscored by the quiet collective desperation of people who had not had enough sleep. Paige Holloway had definitely not had enough sleep. She came through the revolving glass doors at 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the internal briefing she hadn't technically been invited to yet, but had already prepared 3 visual aids for moving at the particular velocity of a woman who had mapped the exact number of steps between the entrance and the elevator bank and was currently burning through her buffer time at an alarming rate. Her bag was open. It was always open. She kept meaning to replace the clasp. The badge was clenched between her teeth because both hands were occupied. Left hand, a cardboard cup of coffee that had been scalding 20 minutes ago and was now at the precise temperature of functional. Right arm, a stack of folders color-coded in a system that made complete sense to her and baffled everyone else. The folders were coral for preliminary findings, sage green for supporting data, and a very specific shade of dusty rose for items that needed follow-up, which was not the same as coral, no matter what anyone said. She hit the elevator button with her elbow. The doors opened, she stepped in. She exhaled, and then the day introduced itself properly. He came through the elevator doors in the last possible second before they closed. Tall, dark-suited, with the kind of unhurried confidence that suggested he had never once in his life worried about missing a train, an elevator, or anything else. He stepped in without looking up from the phone in his hand, and the elevator gave a small mechanical shudder the way old buildings do when they have opinions. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. The shudder was enough. Paige's bag slipped from her shoulder. She grabbed for it. The folders tilted. She grabbed for those. The coffee, unfortunately, was the thing she could not save. It happened in slow motion, and very fast at the same time. The lid came off. The coffee, still, as it turned out, quite warm, made a graceful, decisive arc through the air and landed directly on the man's tie. A dark, clearly expensive, very Italian-looking tie. There was a silence. Paige stared at the tie. Then she looked up. And that was the moment she registered, with a small internal collision that she would spend the next several weeks refusing to acknowledge, that the man standing in front of her was the most absurdly handsome person she had ever encountered at close range. Not handsome in the soft, forgettable way, handsome in the way that made a person briefly forget what words were for. Strong jaw, dark eyes, the kind of composed expression that suggested he was already calculating 3 things at once. He was looking at the tie, then he looked at her. The moment lasted approximately 1.5 seconds. In that time, Paige assessed the situation, made a decision, and collected herself with the focused efficiency she brought to every professional setback. She crouched down, gathering the scattered contents of her bag. A pen, a small notebook, a compact mirror, a lipstick cap that had apparently been living in there for months, 2 biscuits wrapped carefully in a paper napkin, and a tiny framed photograph that she tucked away quickly before anyone could ask about it. He crouched down too, being marginally helpful, and their heads knocked together with a soft, undignified thud. "Sorry," they said simultaneously. And then, in the small confusion that followed, one of the biscuits slipped from the napkin and disappeared quietly into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. Neither of them noticed. Paige stood, smoothed her coat, collected the folders, looked at him one more time. At the ruined tie, at the composed face, at the dark eyes that were watching her with something she couldn't quite name and didn't have time to investigate. "Send me the dry cleaning receipt by email," she said, with the calm of a woman who had survived worse. "We'll settle it." Then she walked out of the elevator without looking back, badge now in hand, folders realigned, spine straight, as if she had not just assaulted a stranger with breakfast. The doors closed behind her. He stood in the lobby with a coffee-stained tie, an inexplicable biscuit in his pocket, and 3 friends who had been waiting for him just outside the elevator. They had seen everything. The laughter that erupted was immediate, unanimous, and entirely without mercy. Owen Patterson, director of the commercial division of Callaway & Reed, looked down at the biscuit he had just discovered in his pocket, then at his ruined tie, then at the corridor where the woman had disappeared with the focused efficiency of someone who had already moved on completely. "Who," said his friend Marcus, barely containing himself, "was that?" Owen said nothing. He was still looking at the corridor. Daniel, the one who always had an idea, usually a terrible one, was already grinning with the particular energy of a man who saw opportunity in catastrophe. 2 weeks, he said, to make her hate you. He spread his hands like a man presenting a gift. And 2 more to make her fall for you. Owen looked at him. "Bet," Daniel said. Owen looked at the corridor one more time. Then, because he was a man who made decisions quickly and reconsidered them slowly, he said, "Fine." It was, without question, the worst decision he had made in 38 years of generally good judgment. He just didn't know it yet. The Monday following the elevator incident, Paige Holloway arrived at Callaway & Reed at 8:34 a.m., which was 11 minutes earlier than required and 43 minutes later than she had originally planned, owing to a subway delay she had already mentally filed under variables beyond control and released without ceremony. She had been hired on a 6-week temporary contract by the CFO's office to lead an internal restructuring project, a review of operational costs across 4 divisions, with a final report and recommendations to be delivered to the board. It was exactly the kind of assignment she was good at, precise, bounded, consequential, and completely free of ambiguity. There were deliverables, there were deadlines. There was a very clear definition of success, and Paige Holloway had a very clear relationship with success. She found her temporary workspace on the 14th floor, a glass-walled room with a long table, a whiteboard that someone had used to write "Go Hawks" in green marker and then mostly erased, and a window that faced the building across the street. She set her bag down, opened her laptop, and began organizing her folders by color before she had even taken her coat off. It was going to be a good 6 weeks. She had been at the whiteboard for 40 minutes, building a project framework in 3 colors of marker, when the door opened and a colleague from the CFO's team, a practical, fast-talking woman named Sandra, leaned in with 2 coffees and a look of mild curiosity. "Settling in all right?" "Fine, thank you." Paige accepted the coffee. "Who has the corner office at the end of the hall? The one with the glass partition?" Sandra blinked. "That's Owen Patterson, director of the commercial division. He's a partner, been here 7 years. She paused. "Why?" Paige looked back at her whiteboard. Name was on the meeting room schedule, just mapping the landscape. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also not the complete truth, which was that she had passed the corner office on her way in, seen O. Patterson on the nameplate, and experienced a small involuntary recognition. The dark suit, the composed expression, the very particular energy of a man who moved through rooms like he had reserved them in advance. The elevator, the coffee, the tie. She filed it under noted and returned to the whiteboard. The landscape, as she assessed it over the following days, was manageable. The CFO's team was professional and direct. The data she needed was accessible, if not always clean. The office ran on the particular rhythm of a mid-sized financial firm, controlled chaos with a good calendar system. Owen Patterson, she quickly understood, occupied a specific gravitational position in that rhythm. Not her department, not her project, not her concern. He directed the commercial division with the ease of someone who had been doing it long enough that it looked effortless, which Paige suspected meant it wasn't. His name came up in general meetings. His opinions were referenced in other people's sentences. When he walked down the hall, people made room without being asked. She noted all of this the way she noted the building's ventilation schedule, relevant to the environment, not personally significant. This position was moderately easier to maintain when he was at the other end of the floor. It was significantly harder on Wednesday morning, when he appeared in the doorway of the common kitchen, at the precise moment she was trying to fix the coffee machine, which had, without any apparent reason, stopped producing coffee and begun producing a sound like a disappointed trombone. "It does that," he said from behind her. She turned. He was leaning against the doorframe in a charcoal suit, different from the one she'd ruined, she noticed. though she absolutely had not been thinking about his suits, holding a mug with the patience of a man who had negotiated with difficult machinery before. "There's a panel on the left side," he continued. "Second button from the bottom. Hold it for 3 seconds." She looked at the machine, found the panel, pressed the button, counted. The machine made a brief sound of reconsideration and began producing coffee. "Thank you," she said. "Patterson," he said. "Owen Patterson." "I know." She picked up her cup. "Paige Holloway, CFO project team." She nodded once, the way she nodded when information had been exchanged, and the interaction had served its purpose. The dry cleaning receipt never arrived, by the way. Something moved in his expression. Amusement, maybe, or surprise, or both. "I'll send it along." "No rush." She moved toward the door. "Have a good morning." She walked back to her workroom with her coffee and her composure intact, and sat down at her table and stared at her laptop screen for a moment longer than she needed to before opening her spreadsheet. He had very dark eyes. That was simply an observable fact. It was not, she decided firmly, going to be a problem. It became a small problem on Thursday. Owen had spent the better part of Wednesday evening telling himself that his interest in Paige Holloway was entirely strategic. That was, after all, the structure of the arrangement with Daniel and the others. Find the irritation point. Apply gentle, consistent pressure. Let nature and human psychology do the rest. The problem was that by Thursday morning, he had tried 2 approaches, and neither had worked in the intended direction. Approach 1. Arriving at the weekly general meeting, which neither of them was required to attend but both had chosen to, and taking the chair at the head of the table with his customary authority, which generally reorganized the room's energy in a way that made people subtly aware of the hierarchy. Paige had taken the chair to his left, opened her notebook, and begun writing in a system of color-coded shorthand that he found himself watching for longer than was professionally justifiable. She had not been reorganized. She had been, if anything, completely undisturbed. Approach 2, making a remark, measured within professional limits but pointed, about the preliminary timeline she had presented to the room, suggesting that certain phases seemed optimistic, given the division-wide data pull required. She had looked up from her notebook, considered his comment for a moment with the expression of someone genuinely evaluating the content rather than the source, and then said, "That's a fair point. I'll add a buffer to phases 2 and 4. She made a note. "Thank you." He had not expected to be thanked. Marcus, sitting 2 chairs down, had covered his mouth with his hand. Owen had returned to his own notes and spent the remainder of the meeting aware, in the way that becomes difficult to stop once it starts, of exactly where she was sitting, which was irritating, particularly because she gave no indication of being aware of him at all. He walked back to his office after the meeting and stood at his window for a moment, looking at the building across the street. Behind him, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "How's the bet going?" Marcus asked with the careful neutrality of a man who already knew the answer. Owen didn't turn around. "Fine." Marcus nodded slowly. "Sure," he said, and left. Owen looked at the building across the street a moment longer. Across the hall, Paige was at her whiteboard again. He could see the edge of her through the glass, color-coding something with the focused calm of a woman who had absolutely no idea she had just, entirely without effort, gotten under the skin of one of the most composed men in the building. He was going to have to recalibrate. He turned away from the window, sat down, opened his laptop. The problem, he was beginning to understand, was not the approach. The problem was that it was very difficult to irritate someone who had already decided you weren't worth being irritated by. And that, more than anything else so far, irritated him enormously. Owen Patterson considered himself a man of systems. He had a system for running meetings, agenda distributed 24 hours in advance, no item left without an owner, no discussion that ran past its allotted time. He had a system for negotiations. Identify the point of maximum leverage, apply it precisely, leave the other party feeling like they had won something. He had a system for the gym, for his wardrobe, for the 3 types of coffee he ordered, depending on what kind of morning it was. He did not historically have problems with systems. And yet, it was now the end of his 2nd full week of what Daniel had termed Phase 1, strategic irritation, and the scoreboard, if one were being honest, which Owen was finding increasingly difficult, read approximately as follows. Owen Patterson, 0. Page Holloway, a number so high it had become abstract. He had monopolized the 14th floor printer for the better part of a Monday morning, running a document through it in 17 separate batches, which had caused a mild but noticeable disruption to the general workflow of the floor. He had done this with the neutral expression of a man who simply had a great deal to print. Page had gone downstairs to use the 13th floor printer without a word, a sigh, or a single perceptible variation in her facial expression. She had returned 45 minutes later with her documents, a cup of tea she had apparently also acquired on the 13th floor, and the pleasant, disconnected energy of someone who had taken a mildly scenic route and found it acceptable. He had also, in a general meeting that included both divisions, made a comment about the restructuring project's methodology, something about whether the cost analysis framework accounted for seasonal variation in commercial revenue, which was a fair question but delivered with a slight edge that 3 people in the room had definitely noticed. Page had looked at him. Considered. "It does," she said. "I can share the supplementary model if it's useful for your division." The edge had bounced off her like a tennis ball off a concrete wall. "I'll send it over this afternoon," she had added, and written something in her notebook, and that had been the end of that. Marcus, who had witnessed this exchange, waited until they were back in the corridor before he said simply and quietly, "She's going to destroy you." "She's not," Owen said. Marcus said nothing. That was somehow worse. The truly baffling part, the part that Owen turned over during the 20-minute window between his last meeting and his first coffee of the afternoon, was that he had begun looking forward to the moments when they occupied the same space. Not because the strategy was working. It emphatically was not. But because Page Holloway, in the process of being completely unmoved by everything he tried, had become surprisingly interesting to observe. She organized her project documents by color. He had noticed this on the first day, the coral folders, the green ones, the specific pink that apparently meant something different from the coral, and he had assumed it was a quirk, an aesthetic preference without functional logic. Then, in a meeting where the CFO had asked for the Q3 variance data, she had produced it in 11 seconds flat from the correct folder, while 2 other team members were still scrolling through their laptops. He had made a mental note. The system worked. He didn't entirely understand why, but it worked. He had also noticed, this one he noticed against his will, that she carried biscuits in her bag. Small, individually wrapped in paper napkins, the same kind that had migrated into his pocket on day 1. He had seen her take one out during a long afternoon meeting, eat half of it with the quiet efficiency of a woman refueling without disrupting the agenda, and put the other half back. She had done this without looking around to see if anyone noticed. She simply did it, the way she did everything, as if she had assessed the situation, made a decision, and required no external validation for it. He found this, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, somewhat extraordinary. Thursday brought a new development. Owen had a habit, not a system, strictly speaking more of a biological pattern, of arriving at the kitchen at 3:15 p.m. for a coffee that got him through the last stretch of the afternoon. He had been doing this for 3 years. The kitchen was usually empty at 3:15. That was, in fact, the point. On Thursday, Paige was already there. She was standing at the counter with a mug, reading something on her phone with the absorbed concentration she brought to all information sources, and she did not look up when he came in, because she apparently operated on the principle that arriving first established territorial priority. He made his coffee. She read her phone. The kitchen's ventilation system hummed. "The boardroom on the east side has better light in the afternoon," he said, not entirely sure why. "If you're working late." She looked up. There was a pause, the brief considering kind she had before most of her responses, as if she ran everything through a quick internal filter before releasing it. "I don't mind the light in my room. The whiteboard in the east room is bigger. My whiteboard is the right size for what I need." He poured his coffee. She went back to her phone. He stood there for a moment, in the specific discomfort of a man who had initiated a conversation and received a series of perfectly reasonable responses that had nevertheless failed to constitute a conversation. "You hold your mug with both hands," he observed. Paige looked down at the mug, then up at him. "Is that a problem?" "No." "Then why mention it?" He had no answer for this, which was, in his professional experience, extremely rare. He picked up his coffee and left, and behind him he could have sworn, though he was not entirely sure, that he heard the faintest, smallest sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. He walked back to his office with his coffee and the distinct sensation that the situation was no longer developing the way he had intended. That evening, Daniel sent a message to the group. Status report. Owen typed, "On track." He stared at the message for a moment before he sent it. On the other side of the building, in the glass-walled workroom where she had been since 6 p.m., Paige finished the last section of her preliminary analysis, saved the file in 3 places out of professional habit, and reached into her bag for the second half of her biscuit. She ate it, made a note, looked at the whiteboard. There was something mildly unsettling she had been noticing about how often Owen Paterson managed to appear in rooms she was already occupying. It was almost certainly coincidence. The office was not large. People moved through common spaces constantly. She looked at the whiteboard for another moment. The project was going well. The data was clean. The timeline was solid. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. She closed her laptop, put on her coat, and left. She did not, absolutely did not, pass the corner office on her way to the elevator just to see if the light was still on. The light was still on. She kept walking. The invitation had come through the CFO's office on a Wednesday, a formal client dinner, hosted by Hargrove Financial, the firm's most significant external partner, at a private dining room in Midtown. The guest list was curated and specific. Key contacts from the CFO's team, senior representatives from the commercial division, and a handful of executives from Hargrove itself. Sandra had forwarded the calendar invite to Paige with a note. "You'll represent the restructuring project. Smart dress, client likes precision, knows her stuff, asks questions, you'll be fine." Paige had replied, "Understood. Thank you," and then spent approximately 4 minutes longer than usual standing in front of her wardrobe, which was not a thing she typically did, and which she attributed entirely to professional preparation and not at all to the knowledge, already circulating in the calendar details, that Owen Paterson would be attending on behalf of the commercial division. She wore a deep burgundy dress, fitted through the waist and elegant without trying, that she had bought 2 years ago for a conference dinner and had not found occasion for since. She pulled her hair back simply, added small gold earrings, and decided the whole thing was adequately appropriate and moved on. The dining room was the kind of space that understood drama. Dark wood paneling, long white tablecloths, candles in clusters down the center of every table, and the low hum of several important conversations happening at polite volume simultaneously. Paige arrived at 7:02, which was 2 minutes after the stated start time and 4 minutes before anyone of consequence, and was escorted to her seat by a very earnest young man with a seating chart. Her seat, as it turned out, was at a round table for 8 near the window. She had barely settled her napkin when she became aware, through no deliberate surveillance on her part, that Owen was moving across the room toward the same table. He was in a dark suit, a very good dark suit, she observed, with the detachment of someone cataloguing environmental data, and he was moving through the space the way he always moved through spaces, which was with the infuriating, unearned ease of a man who had never once in his life wondered whether he belonged somewhere. He reached the table, looked at the name card to her left, sat down. "Holloway," he said. "Patterson," she replied. He picked up his menu. She picked up hers. The candle between them flickered. The evening was not what she had braced for. She had expected him to be performatively charming, the kind of corporate dinner charm that was technically impressive but left you feeling slightly managed. Instead, he was simply competent. Attentive to the clients, precise when the conversation turned to business, capable of making the Hargrove CFO, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a very low tolerance for wasted words, laugh twice in the first 40 minutes. Paige found this unexpectedly difficult to be neutral about. The conversation shifted toward the restructuring project naturally, as these things do, and the Hargrove CFO, Margaret, who had apparently been briefed and was genuinely curious, asked Paige several detailed questions about methodology with the specific interest of a woman who had done similar work herself. Paige answered directly without hedging and felt the small, warm competence of being asked questions she actually knew the answers to. At some point during this exchange, she became aware that Owen had stopped following the conversation with the Hargrove COO to her left and was, instead, following hers. She didn't look at him directly. She knew because the slight shift in his attention had a particular quality, like a room pressure change, Barely perceptible, but there. She kept her eyes on Margaret and kept talking. But twice, just twice, when she made a point with particular precision, she felt rather than saw him angle his head slightly toward her, the way people do when something catches their interest unexpectedly. She did not find this significant. She noted it and moved on, which was what she did with all information. The dinner ended at 9:30, and the evening, which had been sharp and clear when they arrived, had transformed while they were inside. The kind of cold, solid November rain that came without announcement and without any interest in timing. The doorman opened the restaurant's glass door and looked apologetically at the street. Several people produced umbrellas from bags and cars with the smug preparation of people who had checked the forecast. Paige looked at the curtain of rain and performed a rapid internal calculation. Her coat was wool, her shoes were not waterproof, and the nearest covered cab stand was half a block in the wrong direction. Here. Owen had appeared beside her. His umbrella was already open. A large, well-built umbrella, the kind that suggested he too had not checked the forecast, but happened to carry one anyway, which was somehow both useful and mildly insufferable. She looked at the umbrella, then at him. "I'm going east," she said. "You're probably—" "East is fine," he said. It was said simply, without strategy in it. Just said. They stepped out together under the umbrella, and the city closed around them in the particular way it does in the rain. All the noise muffled slightly, the lights blurring, the sidewalk emptied of everyone who had better sense than to be outside. They walked a block and a half toward the cab stand. The umbrella was large enough for two, but not generous about it. His shoulder was close to hers. His pace adjusted naturally to match hers, without her having to slow down, which she noted because most people did not do this without being asked. She could see the slight mist on his breath in the cold. He was looking straight ahead. "Margaret liked you," he said. "She liked the data," Paige said. "She's a data person. She liked the way you delivered it." He paused. "There's a difference." She didn't respond immediately. They reached the cab stand and she lifted her hand, and a cab appeared with the cooperation that New York occasionally offers when it is feeling generous. She turned to him. The rain was still coming, and the light from the street caught the edge of his face and made the moment feel briefly like something from a different kind of story. "Thank you," she said. "For the umbrella." He nodded once. His expression was, she searched for the word and couldn't find one she trusted, different from his usual composed default, quieter, something slightly unguarded. She got into the cab. The door closed. Owen stood with the umbrella for a moment on the sidewalk after the cab pulled away, rain running off its edges, and tried to remember exactly where it was he'd been planning to go. He couldn't. He called a cab of his own and stood there in the rain an extra 3 minutes waiting for it, which he did not mind at all. Marcus, who had been exiting the restaurant approximately 30 seconds behind them, had seen the whole thing from the doorway with his own umbrella unopened in his hand and an expression of deep, uncharitable satisfaction. He took out his phone. He typed, "I've seen everything I needed to see." He sent it to no one. He just needed to type it. Then he went home. And across the city, in the back of a cab with rain-streaked windows, Paige Holloway pressed her coat collar up, looked out at the blurring lights, and permitted herself, privately and briefly, to acknowledge that the evening had been, in a way she hadn't entirely planned for, rather good. She filed this information under Noted, closed the folder, but this time, unlike every other time, it didn't quite close all the way. Nobody formally announced the shift. It simply happened, the way most significant things happen, gradually, then all at once, and always without the courtesy of a warning. It started with the coffee. On the Monday after the client dinner, Owen arrived at the kitchen at his usual 3:15, made his coffee, and then, without having planned to, without any strategic calculation attached to the action, made a second one. He knew how she took it. He had observed this the way he observed all useful information, once accurately and without forgetting it. Black, half a sugar, no milk, simple, decisive, no fuss. He had thought, of course, when he first noted it, which was either a professional observation or something else entirely, and he chose not to investigate which. He walked to her workroom, knocked once on the open door, and set the cup on the corner of her table without comment. She looked up from her spreadsheet, looked at the cup, then at him. "You didn't have to," she began. "I was already making one," he said. This was true. It was also insufficient as an explanation for why he had made two, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. She looked at the cup one more moment. "Thank you," she said, and went back to her spreadsheet. He went back to his office. He sat down. He opened his laptop. He had absolutely no idea what he was doing. It happened again on Tuesday and Wednesday. By Thursday it had become, without any declaration or agreement, simply a thing that occurred. 2 coffees at 3:15, one of which ended up on the corner of a specific table on the 14th floor. Paige did not comment on it after the first day. She simply made space for the cup when it arrived, and occasionally, when she was in the middle of something complex, she would reach for it without looking up, the way a person reaches for something they've already decided belongs in arm's reach. He noticed this. He was not prepared for how much he liked it. For her part, Paige had made the executive decision to stop pretending she didn't notice things. She noticed things. She was, professionally and constitutionally, a noticer. And the subject currently generating the most data was Owen Patterson, who had apparently decided, for reasons she had not yet fully decoded, to stop being the calculated irritant of the first 2 weeks and become something considerably more difficult to categorize. He was still too confident. He still took up too much space in rooms. He still had the habit of asking questions in meetings that were technically valid, but delivered at angles, which she had learned to handle with the efficiency of a person who had read the instruction manual. But there were other things now. There was the way he held the door, not with any flourish, just held it without turning it into a performance. There was the way he listened in meetings, which she had begun to identify as genuinely attentive rather than strategically patient. He looked at whoever was speaking, not at his phone, not at his notes. He was actually listening. She respected this more than she wanted to, and there was the jaw thing. She had discovered the jaw thing entirely by accident. During a general meeting on Thursday afternoon, where a junior analyst from the commercial team was presenting a financial model that contained 3 errors so fundamental that they suggested the model had perhaps been built during a power outage. Owen was seated across the table. He was holding a pen. He was reading the slide, and his jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. A small, barely there compression along the lower left side of his face, the kind of micro-expression that most people produce and nobody notices. Paige noticed. She looked back at her own notes, looked up, looked at him again, specifically at the jaw. The model moved to its next slide, which contained an additional error, and the jaw did it again. She wrote in her notebook, in very small letters that no one else could read, "Tightens when disagreeing." Left side. This was professional behavioral observation. This was useful data. She was building a picture of how the people in this environment communicated and processed information, and that picture was a legitimate part of her project context. This was absolutely what it was. She looked at her notebook, at the very small letters. She turned the page. The best friend arrived on Friday for their weekly lunch, as she did every Friday, with the punctuality of someone who treated lunch with the same seriousness as a court date. Her name was Claire Donovan, and she worked 3 blocks away at a mid-size consulting firm, and she had been Paige's closest friend for 11 years, which was long enough that she had a proprietary sense of Paige's emotional weather systems. She put her coat over the chair, looked at Paige, and said, "Something happened." "Nothing happened," Paige said. "You have the organized face." "I always have an organized face." "You have the extra organized face, the one you get when you're filing something you can't figure out where it goes." Claire picked up the menu with the efficiency of someone who already knew what she was ordering and didn't need it. "Who is he?" Paige set down her own menu. "There's no he." Claire looked at her over the laminated edge with the patience of a woman who had lived through 11 years of Paige Holloway deflections and had never once accepted one. "Name," she said. "I'm not." "Name." Paige picked up her water glass. "His name is Owen Patterson. He's a director in the commercial division. We occasionally occupy the same floor. He brings me coffee at 3:15, and I don't know why, and it is not relevant to anything." Claire set the menu down very slowly. Her smile was beginning at the corners of her mouth with the inevitability of a sunrise. "He brings you coffee. It's not every day?" Paige looked out the window. "Most days." Claire said nothing for a long moment. Then, with the satisfied gravity of a woman delivering a verdict, "Paige, honey, that's a he." Paige opened her menu. "Order your food, Claire." Claire ordered her food. But she smiled for the rest of lunch with the expression of someone who had just been handed a very interesting project. Paige did not find this reassuring at all. The archive room on the 14th floor was not a glamorous space. It was narrow and fluorescent lit, with metal shelving units running the length of both walls, and the particular atmosphere of a place where important things went to be forgotten. It smelled of paper and the faint, committed staleness of recycled air. The door had a habit of swinging shut behind you with a soft but decisive click, as if the room had opinions about interruptions. Paige had been in there 3 times already that week, retrieving legacy financial reports from the previous fiscal year that formed part of her baseline analysis. The reports were organized, and when she used the word loosely, charitably, and with significant professional sadness, by approximate decade and general feeling. She had spent 40 minutes on Tuesday mentally redesigning the filing system, and then remembered that it was not her filing system to redesign, and returned to simply finding what she needed. On Friday afternoon at 4:47, she went in for the 3rd time. The door swung shut behind her. The fluorescent light hummed. She moved to the second shelf on the left, where the Q3 legacy files lived, and found the folder she needed on the first try, which was a small but genuine victory. She tucked it under her arm, made a note on her phone, and turned to leave. The door opened. Owen was walking in at the exact moment she was walking out, and there was a single, suspended second in which the geometry of 2 people occupying the same narrow doorway caught up with them both. He reached out by instinct to catch her, both hands on her arms, steadying, and she grabbed his sleeve with one hand and the folder with the other, because the folder was important. They stopped. They were close, closer than the hallway outside, closer than the shared umbrella in the rain, closer than any of the corridors and kitchens and meeting rooms that had been accumulating between them for 3 weeks. She could see the specific dark of his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw that she had, through absolutely no fault of her own, memorized. His hands were still on her arms. Her hand was still on his sleeve. The fluorescent light hummed. The room smelled of paper. Neither of them moved. And then, because whatever gravity had taken hold of the room in that moment had made him stupid, or brave, or both, and because he had spent 3 weeks watching her be completely composed and was no longer sure he was, he did not let go. Instead, very slowly, he drew her back 1 step, away from the doorway, and she went. She actually went without resistance, without her usual brisk efficiency that kept everything moving and nothing stopping, and her back met the shelving unit gently, and his hands moved from her arms without entirely leaving them, and he looked at her with an expression that had nothing strategic left in it. She looked back at him. The organized face, Claire would have recognized this immediately and said something unbearable about it, was completely gone. In its place was something considerably less controlled, a slightly quickened breath, a faint warmth in her cheeks that she was absolutely blaming on the inadequate ventilation, and eyes that were looking at him with a directness that was no longer the professional, assessing kind. He was looking at her mouth. She knew he was looking at her mouth because she could feel it the way you feel a change in weather, before it arrives, in the pressure, in the way the air shifts. And the part of her brain that had been managing this entire situation with meticulous, color-coded discipline sent up a very clear advisory. This is the distraction you were warned about. And the rest of her, which had apparently stopped taking directives, thought, I know. His face was very close. His hands hadn't moved. The distance between them was no longer a professional distance. Her phone buzzed, not a gentle buzz, a sustained, emphatic, commitment to itself buzz that meant a calendar alert, which meant the 5 p.m. check-in with Sandra that she had set 3 reminders for and had still somehow almost forgotten. The spell, if that was what to call it, and she was not calling it that, cracked. Her eyes refocused. She looked at the phone in her hand, then at Owen. His expression had shifted, the unguarded look pulled back like a curtain, replaced with something more contained, though not entirely, not yet. She stepped sideways, out of the shelving unit, the folder pressed to her chest. I have a meeting, she said. Her voice was professional. Mostly. He straightened, put one hand in his pocket, looked at the shelving unit as if it had done something. Right. She moved past him toward the door. Her neck was warm. She was not acknowledging her neck. Paige. She stopped. Didn't turn around. He said nothing for a moment. Then, the folder you need. The Q4 supplement for fiscal year prior is one shelf up from where you've been looking. Left side. She stood in the doorway. How do you know what folder I need? I know what the project requires. A pause. You've been in here 3 times this week. She turned her head just enough to see him peripherally over her shoulder. He was standing where she'd left him, jacket slightly displaced from where her hand had been, and he looked, not for the first time, and not in a way she could file anywhere sensible, like a man who was losing control of something and hadn't decided yet whether to retrieve it. Thank you, she said. She left. She walked directly to the women's restroom at the end of the corridor, put cold water on her wrists, a thing she had read once about resetting your nervous system, and looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 7 seconds. You have a meeting, she told her reflection. Her reflection, to its credit, looked organized. The neck was still warm. Owen stood in the archive room for a moment after she left. He looked at the shelving unit. He looked at the door. He picked up the folder he'd nominally come in for, which he hadn't actually needed urgently, a fact that he registered and set aside, and walked back to his office. He sat down, did not open the folder. Marcus appeared in his doorway at 5:15 with a coffee and the expression of a man who already knew. Don't, Owen said. Marcus set the coffee on the desk and left without a word. Owen looked at the door, looked at the coffee, looked at the window. Outside, the city moved with its usual productive indifference. Inside, Owen Patterson, who had a system for everything, who did not make decisions he hadn't fully considered, who had, in 38 years, never found himself standing in an archive room, behaving like a man in the second act of something he didn't have a plan for, picked up his pen, opened his calendar, and stared at it until the words stopped making sense. He was realizing with some belated clarity, absolutely no idea how to proceed, which was either the beginning of a problem or the beginning of something else entirely. He suspected, with a certainty that had no business logic behind it whatsoever, that it was the second one. It started, as many catastrophes do, with a group chat. Daniel had created the group 3 years ago for the express purpose of coordinating fantasy football picks, sharing objectionable memes, and occasionally discussing things that didn't require the professionalism of an actual work channel. It was called, with a total absence of creativity, The Three, and it had served its purpose without incident for 36 months. Until Daniel, who was writing a message about the bet on his phone while simultaneously holding a coffee and a conference call on speakerphone, sent it to the wrong group. The message read, Week 4 status check. O still hasn't made her hate him. Pretty sure he's the one falling. Pay up if she doesn't crack in the next 2 weeks. It was specific. It was detailed. It contained enough information that anyone who read it and happened to know both parties could assemble the full picture without difficulty. He had sent it not to The Three, but to the Thursday crowd, a broader, more professionally mixed group of approximately 14 people that included colleagues, acquaintances, and one person who was, by the particular comedic cruelty of fate, Claire Donovan. Claire was in a meeting when the message arrived. She excused herself, with a polished professionalism that she immediately abandoned in the hallway, and read it twice. Then she read it once more to make sure she was reading it correctly. She was. She typed back into the group. Wrong thread, I think? Not because she was being helpful, but because she needed confirmation that what she had just read was real. Daniel, realizing what he'd done, replied with a single word that did not bear repeating. Claire put her phone in her bag. She walked back into the meeting. She sat down. She finished the meeting. And then she called Paige. They met at the small coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, the one Paige preferred because it had corner seating and didn't play music at a volume that competed with thought. Claire arrived first, which had never happened before in 11 years of friendship, and which Paige understood immediately was a sign. She sat down. Claire put her phone on the table and turned it face up to show the message. Paige read it. The room did not spin. Her hands did not shake. She simply read it, once completely, the way she read all information, and then she set the phone back on the table and folded her hands. Claire was watching her with the careful attention of someone prepared to catch a person or a piece of furniture, whichever fell first. Neither fell. How long do you think it's been going? Paige asked. Her voice was level. Based on the wording, from the beginning. Claire paused. The elevator. Paige nodded slowly. She thought about the coffee at 3:15, the umbrella in the rain, The archive room, the way he had said the aposta acabou faz tempo. No, she corrected herself. The way he would eventually have said something like that, because that was the direction it had been heading, and she had known it and let herself believe it was real. She thought about the jaw, the specific memorized tightening of his jaw. She thought about the folder she was still carrying when she left the archive room, because she had held on to it even when everything else slipped. "Okay," she said. Claire blinked. "Okay. I have a project to finish." Paige picked up her coffee. "I'm going to finish it." "Paige." "I'm fine, Claire." Claire looked at her, the organized face, the level voice, the hands that were perfectly still, and said nothing for a moment. Because she knew after 11 years that "I'm fine" in this particular register meant something considerably more complicated than fine. It meant that Paige had taken something real and put it somewhere internal, where it couldn't make noise or affect her stride, or show up uninvited in the middle of a presentation. It also meant that the smile, the real one, the one that occasionally broke through her professional composure and made her whole face different, was going to be absent for a while. Claire reached across the table and squeezed her hand once, briefly, and said nothing. That was the right thing to do, and she knew it. The next morning, Paige arrived at the office at her usual time, greeted Sandra with her usual efficiency, and sat down at her table in the glass-walled room. At 3:15, Owen appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees. She looked up. Her expression was pleasant, organized, and completely closed. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to keep doing that." He set the cup down. Something in her tone registered. He could see it in the slight adjustment of his posture, a subtle recalibration. "Paige, I have a deadline this afternoon." She looked back at her screen. "Have a good day, Owen." He stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he left. The coffee sat on the corner of her table, and she did not reach for it for a very long time. Across the floor, in his corner office, Owen set his own cup down and looked at nothing in particular. He didn't know yet what had happened, but he understood, with the precision of a man who read rooms for a living, that something had. The door that had been slowly opening, quietly, without announcement, in coffee cups and umbrellas and archive rooms, was now closed. And this time, it was not the kind of close that felt temporary. The first attempt was in the corridor. Owen caught up with her on Monday morning between the elevator and the CFO's conference room, which gave him approximately 30 feet of walking time and the particular disadvantage of having to match her pace while also constructing a sentence worth saying. "I need to explain something," he said. "You don't," she said, without slowing down. The tone was not unkind. It was simply sealed, courteous and sealed, like a letter that had already been filed. "The bet, Owen." She stopped at the conference room door, turned to face him with the full, organized calm of a woman who had decided on a position and committed to it entirely. "I understand what it was. I don't need the explanation. We don't have a personal relationship that requires one." A pause. "The project is going well. That's what matters right now." She went into the conference room. He stood in the corridor with the specific experience of a man who had walked into a negotiation fully prepared and discovered that the other party had already left the building. The second attempt was a message. He drafted it 3 times. The first version was too long. The second version was too short and read, he realized on review, like a legal disclaimer. The third version was, he thought, honest, plain, and said what it needed to say without performance. He sent it at 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday. She read it at 7:51. He could see the small red confirmation beneath the message. Her reply arrived at 8:02. "Thank you for saying that. Really. But please don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." Owen set his phone face down on his desk. In the 7 years he had been at Callaway and Reed, navigating negotiations worth millions of dollars across 4 divisions, he had never found 4 words quite as impenetrable as those 4 words. Daniel, sitting across from him at dinner that same evening, had the decency to look genuinely remorseful, which, for Daniel, involved an unusual level of stillness and the absence of a single attempt at humor. "I'm sorry," he said, for the 4th time that week. "I am genuinely, completely sorry." "I know," Owen said. "I'll fix it. I can talk to her. I can explain that it started as a stupid—" "Don't go near her," Owen said, quietly, but absolutely. Daniel closed his mouth. He looked at his dinner. "Right. Marcus, who was the third at the table and had said almost nothing all evening, looked up from his glass. "You know what your problem is." "I'm sure you'll tell me," Owen said. "You've been trying to explain the bet." Marcus set down his glass. "She doesn't need the explanation. She knows what the bet was. What she doesn't know—" He paused with the timing of a man who had been waiting for this moment. "Is that it ended?" Owen looked at him. "Not on paper," Marcus said. "Not in a message. She needs to see it end." He shrugged with the magnificent brevity of a man delivering his one piece of wisdom and immediately withdrawing. "That's it. That's all I have." He picked up his glass again. Owen said nothing for a long time. The third attempt was in person on Wednesday at 5:45 p.m. when he knocked on the open door of her workroom and leaned against the frame. She was at her laptop. She looked up and something moved briefly in her expression, something that wasn't quite the sealed courtesy, before her face settled. "I know you said not to worry about it," he said. "Owen, I'm not explaining the bet." He kept his voice level. "I'm telling you it ended a long time before any of this, and that everything since then has been—" He stopped, said the next part with the slightly uncomfortable honesty of a man who didn't perform vulnerability often and wasn't entirely sure where to put his hands. "Real." She held his gaze for a moment. There was a version of her expression he hadn't seen before. Not the organized face, not the sealed courtesy, but something more exposed and more careful, as if she was weighing something she couldn't quite put down. "I appreciate that," she said. And then quietly, "I just need some time." He nodded once. "All right." He left. She turned back to her laptop and looked at the spreadsheet on the screen without reading it for approximately 90 seconds. The days that followed had a particular atmosphere, civil, functional, and carefully maintained by both of them. They passed in corridors and exchanged professional nods. They attended the same meetings and performed their respective roles without friction. She no longer had a reason to close her door, but it was closed more often now, the way things are when a habit changes and the new setting takes time to feel natural. Owen stopped bringing the coffee. He understood, without being told, that the cup on the corner of the table was currently more pointed than kind. He did, however, and he wasn't sure why he did this or what he thought it would accomplish, make sure the printer on the 14th floor was always available in the morning when she arrived. It was a small thing, possibly unnoticed. He did it anyway. And if Marcus noticed, which he did, he had the considerable wisdom to say absolutely nothing about it. It arrived at 6:17 p.m. on a Thursday, an email from Vantage Data Solutions. The external firm contracted to supply the consolidated revenue figures for the final phase of the restructuring report. The subject line read, "Revised Delivery, Important Notice." Paige opened it the way she opened all emails after 6 p.m., efficiently prepared for minor inconvenience. What she found was not a minor inconvenience. Vantage had delivered the wrong data set. Not slightly wrong, categorically wrong. The figures they had sent corresponded to a different client's account, anonymized but structurally incompatible with Callaway and Reed's divisional model. 3 weeks of calculations that had used those figures as a baseline were now built on the wrong foundation. The board presentation was in 14 hours. Paige sat very still for a moment. Then she opened a new spreadsheet, pulled up the project folder, coral green, dusty rose, all of it, and began dismantling 6 weeks of work with the focused calm of someone performing emergency surgery on something they built with their own hands. She sent one email to Sandra. "Data issue, Vantage. I'm handling it. We'll have corrected version ready for 9 a.m. She did not flag it as urgent. The all caps and exclamation points that other people used in crises cost her nothing to skip, and wasted time she didn't have. She turned off the overhead light. It was giving her a headache, and worked by the light of her laptop and the ambient glow of the city through the window. The floor had emptied. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere below, the building's ventilation settled into its night setting with a low, reliable hum. By 8 p.m., she had rebuilt the first section. By 8:45, she had identified which figures could be reconstructed from internal sources and which required a secondary call to Vantage's emergency line, which she had already placed and was waiting for. Her eyes were dry. She pressed the back of her hand against one of them briefly, which was not something she would have done if anyone had been watching. No one was watching. The door opened. She looked up, expecting Sandra, or the cleaning crew, or no one, and Owen was standing in the doorway. He was still in his shirt and trousers from the day, jacket gone, sleeves pushed up in the way that meant he had already been working late himself. He looked at the scattered documents, the two open laptops, the color-coded chaos that had migrated from organized to urgent, and at her, at the eyes that she knew were slightly red at the edges, which she was not going to acknowledge. He said nothing. He came in, pulled out the chair beside her, sat down, and reached for the nearest spreadsheet. "Owen, which version is the corrected base model?" he asked. She looked at him. "You don't have to." "Page." He looked at her. Calm, direct, no negotiation in it. "Which version?" She held his gaze for 1 second, then she turned her laptop toward him and pointed. They worked. Not in the careful, managed way of two people being professionally cooperative. They worked the way people work when something real is at stake. Quickly, with minimal speech, handing documents across the table without ceremony, catching each other's errors without comment, building the corrected model the way you build anything that has to hold weight, from the bottom up, with precision and no wasted motion. Owen knew the commercial division's figures from memory. This turned out to be, in practical terms, extraordinary. Paige had been navigating the data with her own rigorous methodology, but having someone beside her who could verify divisional numbers in real time without looking them up, without a single hesitation, it changed the architecture of the problem. What had looked like a 14-hour reconstruction became something she could see the end of. Vantage's emergency line called back at 9:40. Owen watched her handle it. The clear, exact language, the specific questions, the way she ended the call in under 4 minutes with exactly what she needed, and nothing extraneous. He made a note on the spreadsheet while she was on the phone, correcting a formula in column G without being asked. She looked at it when she hung up, then at him. "You caught that in under 30 seconds, she said. "Column G is always where it hides," he said, without humor, without performance, just said. Something moved in her face, not the organized composure, not the sealed courtesy, but something quieter and considerably more honest than either. They kept working. At 11:55, she ran the final validation. The model held, every figure reconciled. The report was structurally sound, the presentation ready, the conclusion clear and defensible. She looked at the screen for a long moment, and then she exhaled, the full released kind, the kind that has been held in place by effort for several hours and finally permitted to leave. She turned to him. He was watching her with an expression that had nothing managed about it, nothing strategic, nothing composed for effect. He looked in the quiet of the empty floor with the city glowing behind him, like a man who had stopped performing several hours ago and forgotten to put it back on. "The bet ended a long time ago," he said, quietly, simply, the same words he had said before, but this time in an empty room, without the corridor between them, without anything between them at all. She looked at him, at the honest, unguarded face, at the sleeves still pushed up, the pen still in his hand, and Paige Holloway, who had color-coded her entire professional life, who had said, "I'm fine," when she wasn't, and don't worry about it. When she did, leaned forward first. The kiss was soft at the start, the way things are when they've been held back long enough that arriving feels almost impossible. His hand came up to her face, careful, as if she might change her mind, and she didn't. The rain had started against the window at some point, without either of them noticing, and now it was there, constant and quiet, while the city went on outside, and the corrected report sat open on the laptop, and neither of them looked at it at all. When they pulled back, the room was the same room. Everything else was different. She looked at him. He looked at her. "The report is ready," she said. "I know," he said. A pause. "Thank you," she said. "For tonight." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "Get some sleep," and then at the door. "You were going to finish it without me." She met his eyes. "Yes, I know that too," he said, and he left. She turned back to the window, to the rain, to the city that had been there the whole time. She pressed her fingers to her lips once, briefly, the way a person touches something to make sure it was real. It was. The board approved the report at 10:23 a.m. The CFO used the word exemplary, which was not a word he deployed casually. Margaret from Hargrove, who had joined by video, said the methodology was the clearest she had seen in a restructuring review in several years. Sandra sent Paige a message immediately after that contained only 3 letters, yes, in capitals, which from Sandra was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Paige received all of this with her usual measured composure, and then went to the women's restroom, stood at the sink and allowed herself a private, undignified, entirely genuine smile for approximately 8 seconds. Then she washed her hands and went back to work. The days that followed were different in a way that was difficult to quantify, but impossible to miss. Nothing had been formally declared. No conversation had happened over the terms of what the first kiss meant, or where it placed them relative to anything. They were both by disposition people who did not rush the labeling of things. Paige because she processed carefully, and Owen because he had learned recently and with some humility that he did not always know as much as he thought he did. What existed instead was a kind of quiet accumulation. The coffee came back. 2 cups at 3:15 set on the corner of the table without comment, but this time, when she reached for it, she looked up, and he was still in the doorway, and she said, "Sit down if you have a minute." And he did. And they talked. Not about the project or the divisions or anything with a deliverable attached to it, but just talked, the way people do when they have been circling something for weeks and have finally stopped pretending they aren't. She told him about the color coding system, the full explanation, which she had never given to anyone in a professional context, because it required a certain level of trust that it wouldn't be received as eccentric. He listened without interrupting, asked one question and said, "The Q3 report on the Hargrove account is filed wrong in the East Archive room. It should be Coral." He said it completely seriously. She stared at him for a moment and then laughed, a real laugh, the full kind, not the polite professional version, and he looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of satisfied. He told her about the first years at Callaway and Reed, when the commercial division had been half its current size, and he had spent 14 months rebuilding it from a structural deficit. He did not tell it dramatically. He told it the way he did everything, plainly, precisely, with the particular confidence of someone who has no need to embellish what is already true. She listened and asked the right questions, which he noticed, and her questions were the kind that meant she had been paying attention at a level most people didn't bother with. It was, he thought, one of the better conversations he'd had in years, which was information he kept to himself, since he was not yet at the stage of saying things like that out loud. He was getting there. The small things multiplied with the natural abundance of small things when the conditions are right. He discovered, through honest accident, not investigation, that her favorite biscuit was a very specific shortbread that came from a bakery 2 blocks east of the building, the kind sold in small paper bags with a wax seal that she had apparently been buying herself every Monday morning. He knew this because he had passed her in the lobby on a Monday and seen the paper bag. He had said nothing. On the following Monday, there was a paper bag of the same shortbread on the corner of her table when she arrived. She had stood in the doorway of the workroom and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked down the corridor toward his office. He was at his desk, visible through the glass, reading something. He didn't look up. She went in, sat down, ate one of the shortbreads, and put the rest in her bag for the afternoon. The warmth in her neck, which had been present on and off since the elevator on day 1, and which she had never successfully explained away, made a quiet, knowing reappearance. She did not tell Claire about the shortbread immediately. Claire would react with a level of enthusiasm that Paige was not emotionally prepared to manage on a Tuesday morning. She told her on Wednesday. Claire's reaction confirmed the concern entirely. It involved the words, "He researched your biscuit," delivered at a volume that caused the couple at the next table to look over, and a sustained period of hand-pressing that Paige tolerated with the grace of a woman who knew she deserved it. "I know," Paige said. "He researched your biscuit, Paige. You mentioned that. I'm going to keep mentioning it." Claire leaned back with the satisfied look of someone whose instincts had been completely, thoroughly vindicated. "How are his eyes?" Paige looked at her coffee. "Dark," she said, and then quietly, "Very." Claire said nothing. She simply smiled, the slow, certain smile of a woman who had known something for weeks and had been patient enough to wait for the confirmation. Across the table, Paige was also smiling, not the organized kind, not the sealed professional kind, the full kind, the one that went all the way up and made her entire face different. The same one, though neither of them knew it yet, that was going to bring a very composed man in a very good suit to his knees in a matter of weeks, and absolutely deserve it. The project approval happened on a Friday. By 6 p.m., the The CFO's team had gone home in the particular high spirits of people who had delivered something good and knew it. Sandra had hugged Paige in the corridor, which was not a Sandra thing to do, and which meant considerably more because of it. The 14th floor emptied with the cheerful efficiency of a Friday in late November, and the building's quiet settled in like something earned. Paige was packing her workroom, slowly, methodically, by color, when Owen appeared in the doorway. He had his jacket on. He was holding 2 glasses and a bottle of wine, which was not something she had ever seen him carry down a corridor before. She looked at the glasses, then at him. "The CFO keeps a bottle in the cabinet above the printer," he said. "He told me once that it was for occasions worth marking." A pause. "I asked him this afternoon if tonight qualified." "What did he say?" "He said yes, and to put it back if we didn't finish it." Owen tilted the bottle slightly. "We'll have to finish it," she laughed. He came in, set the glasses on the table, and poured with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided something and was no longer in a hurry about it. She pushed the last folder into her bag and sat on the edge of the table, and he handed her a glass and stood close. Not performing closeness, just close, because the room was small and the evening was that kind of evening. They talked. Not about the project, not about the divisions, not about anything that had a deadline attached to it. He asked about the photograph from her bag, the small framed one that had scattered across the elevator floor on day 1 and that she had never explained. She told him it was her grandmother, who had taught her the color coding system, which had originally been applied not to documents but to recipe cards. He listened to this with the full attention she had come to recognize as specifically his. No phone, no drift, just present. She asked about the 14 months rebuilding the commercial division, the parts he hadn't told her before. He told her, and she listened in the same way. And when he mentioned the moment he'd known the division would hold, a single meeting, a single number that aligned, she said, "That's the feeling. When the columns reconcile." She said it simply, as if they were describing the same country from different roads. He looked at her when she said it. The wine was almost finished. The city outside had gone dark and gold, the way it does on clear winter evenings when the cold makes the lights sharper. The workroom was quiet, the building almost empty, and the space between them had been narrowing in increments so gradual that neither of them had announced it. He took the glass from her hand and set it on the table. She watched him do it. He moved to stand in front of her, close, deliberate, with no remaining pretense that this was anything other than what it was, and lifted his hand to her face, and the touch was careful the way it had been in the archive room, as if he was still giving her time to change her mind. She didn't. The kiss started slow and deepened into something that had the full weight of everything that had been building since a grey Tuesday morning, and a spilled coffee and a biscoito in a suit pocket. His other hand found her waist, and she put her hands against his chest, and the city went on outside the window without them entirely. When they pulled back, she was looking at him with the expression that had nothing organized about it and everything honest. "My apartment is 4 blocks from here," she said. He held her gaze. "I know. I'm telling you," she said, "not informing you of a geographical fact." He almost smiled. "I understood that." They walked the 4 blocks in the cold, shoulders together, not hurrying. Her key stuck in the lock as it always did, and she said something under her breath, and he reached past her and jiggled it with the precise angle of someone who had been told this once and remembered, which made no sense because she had never told him, and she turned and looked at him with narrowed eyes. "How did you know how to do that?" "Educated guess," he said. She let them in. The apartment was hers entirely, warm, books on the shelves organized by color rather than author, a small print above the fireplace, a kitchen that smelled of coffee and something baked recently. He took it in the way he took in all information, once, fully, and without forgetting. She set her bag on the counter and turned, and he crossed the room and kissed her again before she had time to say anything practical, which was probably the correct approach. The evening moved with the unhurried certainty of 2 people who had been patient long enough and had run out of reasons to continue. He held her like something valuable. Not fragile, she was not fragile. He had understood that from the beginning, but valued. He said things quietly against her hair, against her shoulder, things that were true and that she heard fully, and she answered in the way she answered everything that mattered, directly, without pretense. Later, in the dark, with the city quiet below and the cold pressed against the window, She lay with her head against his shoulder and felt not the composed, managed kind of fine, but the true kind, entirely, unexpectedly, thoroughly all right. He was awake. She could tell by the particular quality of his stillness. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But his arm tightened slightly around her, just once, the way things do when they mean something. Outside, the city breathed on. Inside, nothing needed explaining. She woke to the smell of coffee before she was fully conscious. This was, under normal circumstances, her preferred method of returning to the world. Coffee first, then orientation, then everything else. It was a system. The system had served her well for 34 years. What was not part of the system was opening her eyes to find Owen Patterson sitting on the edge of her bed with a tray. Not a glass of water and a muttered, "There's coffee in the kitchen." A tray, with a cafetiere, 2 cups, a plate of shortbread, her shortbread, the specific kind from the bakery 2 blocks east, which he had apparently located at some point between waking up and right now, sliced fruit arranged with the precision of a man who could not approach a task without committing to it, and a small glass of orange juice that she hadn't asked for and somehow wanted immediately. She stared at this tray. Then she looked at him. He was dressed, hair still slightly disordered from sleep in a way that she was not going to comment on because the comment would require an expression she wasn't ready to produce before coffee. He looked entirely too alert for someone who had been awake until well past midnight. "You went out," she said. "Bakery opens at 7. He poured a cup and handed it to her. "Oh, you were asleep. You left and came back and I didn't hear you. You sleep like someone who has very successfully completed a board presentation." He sat comfortably at the end of the bed, as if he had been doing this for years. "I considered waking you, but the data suggested that was a poor decision." She drank the coffee. She looked at the shortbread. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Not the professional courtesy version. The real one." He nodded once, the compact, genuine kind, and picked up his own cup. Outside, the city was performing its Saturday morning routine. Slower, softer, with the particular Saturday light that arrived at a different angle and made familiar rooms look briefly like somewhere else. She ate a shortbread. He watched her with the expression she'd been cataloguing for weeks, the attentive, unhurried kind that she was increasingly certain he wasn't aware he had. She had begun to suspect that Owen Patterson, who was composed and strategic in every professional context she had ever observed him in, had absolutely no idea what his face was doing when he looked at her. This was, privately, one of her favorite things about him. She was not ready to tell him that, but she filed it carefully. "You have too much energy," she said. "It's Saturday." "I have considerable energy on Saturdays," he agreed, without apology. "That's a character flaw. Arguably." He set his cup down. "Although I'd point out that energy has its uses." He looked at her with a completely neutral expression that was doing a very poor job of being neutral. "For example, I could need someone to help me expend it responsibly." She looked at the tray, at the carefully sliced fruit, at the shortbread from the specific bakery, at the orange juice she hadn't asked for. "That is the most audacious thing you have said to me," she said, while holding a breakfast tray. "The tray was a long-term investment," he said. "I'm collecting on it." She laughed, the full, real laugh, the one that arrived without warning, and which he looked at with the expression of a man who had been awarded something he hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. He reached forward and took the tray from her lap, set it on the nightstand with the careful efficiency of a man with intentions, and then lay down beside her in the unceremonious, committed way of someone who had made a decision. She was still laughing when he kissed her, which meant the kiss started badly and improved rapidly, which was, she thought in the brief coherent moment before she stopped thinking about classifications entirely, rather a good summary of them. Later, with the Saturday light now higher and the coffee cold on the nightstand, she was sitting cross-legged on the bed, looking at her phone while he read something on his. The domestic quiet of it was so unremarkable, so straightforwardly comfortable, that it took her a moment to notice how unusual it was to feel this way, not managed, not organized against a deadline, just this. Her contract ended on Friday. She had known this since the beginning. 6 weeks, fixed term, clean exit. She had always treated it as a parameter, not a problem. She had been good at treating most things as parameters. She looked at her phone, at the calendar that had Friday marked with a small, neat star she'd added on day 1. She put the phone face down. Owen turned a page of whatever he was reading. He didn't look up. He shifted his position and his foot rested against hers with the total casualness of someone who was not thinking about it at all. She looked at the ceiling. On Friday, technically, she would need to think about next steps. The project was complete, the contract was complete. The parameters of being in the same building, on the same floor, with 2 coffees and a specific bakery between them, all of that had a defined end date. She had always been good at parameters. She was, she realized, currently less good at this one than she had ever been at anything. Friday arrived with the indifference that Fridays reserve for days that matter. Paige had known it was coming. She had in fact known the precise date since the morning she signed the contract, the way she knew every deadline, every deliverable, every parameter with a fixed end point. She had packed her workroom in stages throughout the week, methodically by color in reverse order of arrival, so that Friday morning would require nothing more than the last bag and the last folder and a clean exit. She was good at clean exits. She had the last bag and the last folder ready by 9 a.m. Sandra came by with coffee and a card signed by the CFO's team, which Paige accepted with genuine warmth and the particular composure of a woman holding something in place by sheer organizational habit. The workroom looked exactly as it had looked on day one, whiteboard clean, table clear, the specific ghost of a dusty rose folder system already gone. She put on her coat. She had not seen Owen that morning. His office light had been on when she arrived. She had not looked on purpose. The corner office was simply in the natural sightline of the corridor, but his door was closed, which meant a call or a meeting, and she was not going to interrupt either just to say something she hadn't yet decided how to say. This was fine. She would send a message, a clean, direct message. Thank you for everything. It's been genuinely good. Here is where I am. Precise. No ambiguity. She was composing this message mentally as she walked down the corridor toward the elevator, bag on her shoulder and folder under her arm, and she was nearly at the elevator bank when she heard her name. She turned. Owen was standing in the corridor outside his office. No jacket, no composed professional posture, just him, in the plain, unhurried way of a man who had made a decision and was standing behind it. She stopped. Your door was closed. I ended the call. He walked toward her. You were going to leave. My contract is finished. I know when your contract finishes, he said. I've known since week 2. He stopped a few feet from her. Something in his expression was different, not the dry composure, not the strategic patience. Open in the specific way he was only open when he forgot to manage it. I made a ridiculous bet. I lost every round from the first minute, and I would like very much... He paused, looked at her with the full unguarded attention of a man who had run out of deflections. To keep losing, if you'll stay. Paige looked at him, at the open face, at the sleeves already pushed up at 9 a.m., because he'd been working since before she arrived, and had not stopped to think about his appearance, which was so completely him that she felt something settle in her chest with a small, decisive click. That is a terrible declaration, she said. I know. I had a better version and I lost it when I saw you putting on your coat. The elevator doors opened beside her. Neither of them moved. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she set the bag down, stepped forward, and kissed him. In the corridor, with the elevator patiently open behind her and the morning going on around them, and he wrapped one arm around her and held her with the certainty of someone who intended to keep doing this indefinitely. When she pulled back, the smile was already there. Not the organized kind, not the professional courtesy kind. The full one, all the way up, reaching everything, the one he had been cataloguing since a grey Tuesday morning when she'd walked out of an elevator without looking back. I'll stay, she said. He exhaled, a small, real, unguarded exhale that she suspected he didn't know he'd been holding since he walked out of his office. Good. I'll need an office, she said. A proper one. With a whiteboard. Done. The big whiteboard, not the small one. Paige. And I'm keeping my color system. I don't want to hear anything about it. I told you 3 weeks ago the Q3 report should be coral, he said, with the perfectly straight face of a man who took this seriously. I've always respected the system, she laughed. He was already smiling, the real one, the rare one she had been collecting without admitting it. The elevator closed. Neither of them noticed. Outside, Manhattan went on with its usual productive noise, and on the 14th floor of Calloway and Reed, The workroom that had been carefully packed and quietly emptied had, without any formal announcement, already ceased to feel like a departure. 6 months later, they were in the middle of an argument about something that had started as a question about dinner reservations and evolved through the particular alchemy of two opinionated people in a shared apartment into a disagreement about whether planning too far in advance removed the spontaneity of an experience or simply respected everyone's calendar. Paige was making her case with both hands, which she did when she was fully committed to a position. Owen was standing with his arms crossed, which he did when he was listening to an argument he intended to dismantle as soon as there was an opening. The apartment was warm, the evening light was low and golden, and they had been at this for 11 minutes. She was mid-sentence, something decisive about the value of a confirmed reservation versus the chaos of walking in without one. When she noticed that he had stopped listening to the words, he was looking at her, not the listening look. The other one, the one she had learned was involuntary, and which she had long since stopped pretending not to recognize. She slowed. What? He uncrossed his arms. He reached into his pocket. He put a small box on the table between them. No announcement, no preamble, no orchestration whatsoever, and stepped back slightly, as if giving her room. She looked at the box, then at him. He said, "Marry me." Not a question, not a performance, just his voice, direct and entirely without armor. The apartment was very quiet. Paige looked at the box for a long moment that Owen later said felt like a personal trial. Then she opened it. The ring was simple and exactly right. She didn't know how he had managed that, but she filed it under. Of course he did. And she looked at it for several seconds without looking up. "You didn't kneel," she said. He knelt. Immediately, without hesitation, with the expression of a man who was doing this under slightly undignified circumstances and did not remotely care. His face, from this angle, was completely open, no dry humor, no composure held in reserve. Just him, looking up at her with everything visible. She started laughing. He started laughing, still kneeling, and neither of them could recover for a full 30 seconds, and the argument, what it had been about, the beginning of it, all of it, dissolved entirely, and neither of them ever remembered how it had started. She took the ring from the box and put it on herself, because she was Paige Holloway, and she had handled every important thing with her own hand since the beginning. He stood up, and she looked at the ring on her hand, and then she looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He kissed her and she kissed him back, and Daniel, who found out 2 hours later via a message Marcus sent to the correct group for once, reportedly sat down on his kitchen floor for a moment to process it. They were married on a Saturday in early spring, in a venue with tall windows and a view of the park that looked like something from a different, kinder era. The ceremony was elegant and specific to them. No excess, no performance, just the things that mattered said clearly in front of the people who had earned the right to hear them. The front row held Owen's 3 friends in a study of contrasts. Daniel, who had proposed the bet and spent 6 months making amends for it, wept from the processional onward and did not attempt to hide it. Marcus, who had never believed the bet would work and had watched everything unfold with the satisfaction of a man whose judgment had been thoroughly vindicated, smiled from the moment Paige appeared until long after the last dance. And James, the third, the one with an unparalleled talent for appearing in the wrong place at the wrong moment, arrived at his seat 2 minutes after the ceremony began, was gently redirected by the photographer, and managed to knock over a flower arrangement on the way to his second attempt. It was removed efficiently and no one mentioned it again. Claire cried from the entrance. Audibly, without apology, with the full-hearted joy of a woman who had known before anyone that this was where it was going, and who had been right about every single bit of it. She gave a toast at the reception that lasted 7 minutes and included 3 things that made Paige cover her face and 2 things that made the room laugh so hard the sound carried to the hallway. Owen danced. He had practiced, secretly, for 3 months, because he was a man who approached preparation with total commitment, regardless of the domain. He stepped on her foot twice anyway. She laughed both times, which was the only outcome he had actually planned for, so he considered it a success. 1 year later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, he was on the phone at the kitchen table with his coffee and his laptop open to a quarterly report. She came in from the bedroom, set something on top of the papers in front of him, and leaned against the counter. He looked down. A pair of tiny shoes, white, impossibly small, placed side by side on the quarterly report with the quiet significance of something that required no explanation at all. He looked up at her. She was smiling. The full smile, the one that went all the way up and had always, from the very first grey Tuesday morning in an elevator, been the thing that undid him completely. He ended the call without saying goodbye. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her for a long time, and she let him. And outside the city went on with its usual reliable noise, and the spring light came through the window at the angle that made everything look like a beginning, which, as it turned out, it was. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.